Hello everybody and welcome to Making the Game, From Concept to Kickstarter, Episode 7. In this episode we will give a status update on where we are with the project and discuss the thought process behind this hero selection we made and how it ties into the overarching plan for the game. I apologize for the gap in publication. We had family in town for over a week and had to entertain. I've been podcasting for over a decade and typically am extremely consistent, but I have a lot going on in my personal life at present with preparing for a wedding, having recently moved, etc., so please bear with me as we settle into a rhythm. On that note, as a heads up, I will miss next week as well as I am off to Tahoe, California for my bachelor party. Some of my best friends and I will be chilling and grilling up in the mountains. I'm really looking forward to it. As you get older, as a lot of you know, it gets harder to stay in touch with your friends. Everyone spreads out and gets busy with their own lives. Also, as an addendum to the last episode, I can't believe I forgot to mention this, but in the last episode, we were talking about playtesting, and I was a playtester for Games Workshop. I was heavily involved in 8th edition of Warhammer 40,000, and I've been a playtester for some indie games as well. That experience showed me both how large and small studios run playtesting systems, and I gained a lot of valuable insights and experience as a result. So it would have been good to mention that in the last episode, but I did want to bring it up now so that listeners understand that I was coming from a place of experience when we were laying out our playtesting system. For an update on where we are with the development process with Bloodthrone, big news is we have begun the molds for the expansion heroes. This is the last major step in regards to the technically difficult and expensive part of the process. It takes 50 to 60 days to complete the molds. We just finished up the process of going over the sculpts and preparing them for the molds. A lot of the times, things you could do with an STL file or a 3D render, you can't actually do in reality in a mold. So you have to go through them painstakingly, model by model, and make sure that they are ready to go into the milling process of machining out the mold. So those should be done in July. Initially, we had planned to finish the core box and Gorgontis expansion first, and then the hero expansion, but as the majority of backers got the hero expansion, it made sense just to do them all together so that we can ship them together. We are very excited to get the expansion heroes done, as the mass production models for the core box and Gorgontis expansion are absolutely awesome. I got them last month, or earlier this month, excuse me, and they exceeded my expectations. They look amazing. The fidelity to the resin masters is extremely good, and as they come pre-assembled in PVC plastic, they're going to be super easy to put on the table, play, paint if you want to paint them. Plus, they will be quite durable as well. That's one of the benefits of PVC plastic as opposed to like a HIPS plastic or especially to resin, is that they're very durable. So if you drop them, odds are they're not going to get completely, messed up or break. So that's one of the benefits of PVC plastic, in addition to being more cost effective. The downside to PVC is that it doesn't hold detail as well as a HIPS plastic, but when I say HIPS plastic, it's high impact polystyrene plastic. That's the kind of plastic you get with like a Gundam kit or a Warhammer 40K model or something like that. It's a very hard plastic, but the problem is that it's not as forgiving. It's very difficult to pull it out of the mold with any sort of an undercut. PVC, on the other hand, you have way less parts because you can pull it out of the mold and it'll kind of like bounce back into shape. So it's a lot easier to have like pre-assembled models. For example, with HIPS plastic, it's almost impossible to do that. So it's more cost effective, much more user friendly. You don't have to do any modeling to get everything ready. And with the newest generation of PVC plastic, I was shocked at how good they look. Like, I think people are going to be blown away with the quality, especially when considering you don't have to do anything to get them ready. You just pull them out and you're ready to go. And interestingly, from feedback from backers, the model that seems to be the most popular so far is Canthus. He is the class Dark Knight, but as more commonly he is called by everyone, including our own staff, he's the Bug Knight. I was really interested that he seems to be the most popular so far based anecdotally on feedback, because I was apprehensive about including that model into the kit because he's the most exotic member of the team. But the Creature Caster studio, they're our partner on the project, and they're the ones that are designing the models. They did such a good job of taking the concept that I had and realizing it, that it just looks incredible. So I wanted to kind of dig into that and use that as a jumping off point to discuss why we chose the heroes that we did for the game. Like, it wasn't just, oh, let's come up with some cool aesthetics and throw them into the game based on, what we think people will like. That obviously played into the consideration, but like literally, like, this was such a long and thought out process as to like, what kind of heroes are we going to include and how is this going to lay the groundwork for where we want to go in the future with the game. And I think the best way to discuss this is to do it contextually. So we'll talk about Canthus, his faction, and then the class that he represents to kind of like put it all, to make it all make sense without having to go through like a long diatribe about rules, mechanics, and things of that nature. So his faction, Canthus' faction, is called the Vespiary. And in the context of the lore of the game, prior to the Throne Wars are the event in our lore that resulted in the death of the Overgods. So when you hear the intro video of like the gods are dead, that's what that's referring to. And those were the goddess of creation and the god of destruction. And they are now dead in the game world, which has caused all kinds of chaos. We'll dive into that more in a future episode because this will go on too long if I sidetrack myself by discussing that. So we'll just take that as a given. In the lore of the game, there was basically a revolt in heaven. The two primary overgods have been destroyed, and that's left this huge void in the world. So the Vespiary, the faction that Canthus comes from, was a peaceful, relatively minor faction of sentient insects that lived in a small area of a part of the world called the Great Forest. During the course of the Throne Wars and after the discovery of Devithae is the extracted and distilled essence of a sentient being. It's drawn out of them via their blood. That ties into the Blood Throne. But during this period of time, during the Throne Wars and then the subsequent Blood Crusade, which came after, the world was devastated. The Vespar suffered all kinds of degradation and damage, as all nations of the world of Chael did. And they discovered through the course of events during that tumultuous period of time that they could use Devithae to implant one of their own larvae into another sentient being, and then that individual would gain powerful benefits, but most importantly, they would lose any sense of painful memories like regret, shame, etc., and they would instead gain a sense of purpose and belonging within like the group mind of the Vespiary. So after the traumatic events of the Throne Wars, much of the population of Chael was destroyed, devastated, displaced, and pretty much everyone lost someone. A lot of them lost everything, their home, their families. And so many of these, devastated individuals that had become refugees or worse, they were willing to make this trade-off when normally they wouldn't, right? So they wanted to get rid of all these painful memories. They wanted to have a new community to join. And the Vespar themselves, the actual sentient insects of the Vespiary, they're actually quite small and frail. So for them, this was a great trade-off. They're like, oh, wow, we could get these hardy, strong, dynamic races to join us and become a part of the group mind. So for them, they're like, oh, this is great. Like this dramatically makes us better protected in this, dangerous new world that we find ourselves in. And on top of that, in a world that now had a huge power vacuum, not only did they find themselves able to resist all these, aggressive forces trying to destroy their home, they found themselves able to actually begin to expand. So in the world of Chael, pretty much every faction, apart from the Immortal Host, which we'll discuss later, is in decline. They're all barely hanging on by their fingernails. Like, think Attack on Titan, not with, giant, weird monsters eating everybody, but, societies that are on the brink of destruction. The Vespiary is one of the few that is now expanding. They're flourishing in this new environment, but they need this very negative resource called Devithae, which is extracted from living sentient creatures against their will. It's a painful and fatal process. They need that in order to continue to flourish and grow. So it's this really interesting dichotomy of they're not necessarily evil, but they have to do something that's evil in order to survive and thrive. So Canthus is one such individual, right? In his backstory, he experienced some incredible trauma. Everything he knew and loved was destroyed. He was aimless. He was basically suffering from PTSD and deep depression. didn't really understand his place in the world. And when he encountered some, basically missionaries from the Vespiary explaining like, hey, if you join us, you'll change, but you'll also have a new sense of purpose, and all that pain and all that trauma will be gone. So he was like, all right, let's do this. And one of the things that we thought would be interesting and fun to write into the lore of the Vespiary was that in order to spread their ideology and grow, they don't do it through forced conversions. It's not like the Borg from Star Trek, for anybody who's familiar with that, where they make you do it. They actually prophesize. Like they have people that go out and recruit. They convince you through reason that this is the best way forward for everybody. They prefer willing converts to their cause, as the individuals that join them, they don't become mindless drones. They retain their mental faculties and much of their personality. Their personality is dulled to a degree. They gain a mental connection to the group mind. They have a sense of purpose. They can be given instruction from great distance from the Vespar. So they do change, but what they have found is that a willing convert is far more effective than trying to force it. So what this means is that in the game world, if you were playing like an RPG type session, you could encounter like a missionary from the Vespiary spreading the good word of joining the hive mind. So we thought that was really fun, a lot more interesting than sort of the typical forced assimilation. It makes them also much more quote unquote human. It gives them motivations that are much more understandable. So we were really excited about the way that faction started to develop, because it started out as the most exotic. Like, how the heck do we put an insect faction or an insect-themed faction into the game and not have it just be a cliche? Plus, it provides the opportunity for some truly amazing models, miniatures. So practically what this means is once we get to the point in the overall game development, and I say game development is not just the core box, like where we're at right now, but where we want to be in the future. When we get to the Vespiary, you can expect a faction that has sentient insects teamed up with recognizable high fantasy races like elves, humans, dwarves, etc., that have like a biosuit Guyver style insect exoskeleton. We're really excited, right? It's going to look very cool, very unique, and it's going to be a lot of fun to fully flesh it out. We will dedicate a show to each faction as we go forward, but that gives you kind of a sense of the depth we put into every aspect of this project, and it's the main reason why it took so long to make, because we weren't just making the core game, the expansions. We were trying to plan into the future basically 10 years. Like, how can we make this something where there's reliable and consistent content coming out that's not just kind of like ad hoc tacked on after the fact? Because I've been in the miniature gaming industry and also just playing for pretty much my entire life since I was a child. And it's a trap that you see frequently is a company comes out with a game, the game is popular, and they don't have a roadmap forward. So they start just kind of like tacking things on. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the balance of the game gets all screwed up. So we wanted to take the time before we got going to have a roadmap forward. And we put this much care and thought into every faction of the game. And so that's why in the core game and the expansion, each hero is different. Now that's pretty common when you're playing like a Dungeon Diver game or a board game like this, is that, you have some, usually pretty recognizable and common themes. For us, it was extremely deliberate. We went through multiple ideas for each of the heroes. And the reason why it was such an intricate process is because we wanted to plan forward into the future. Like, okay, how does this character represent the faction that they come from, so that you as the gamer can look at it and get a pretty clear sense of like, oh, okay, I have a pretty good idea of the area, the land that this hero comes from, and what I can expect in the future from this faction when that time comes. So in the core box, each hero comes from a different faction. So obviously that's 12. In the expansion, in the hero expansion, half of the heroes come from one of the other factions. It's a total of 18 that we've already fully planned out. And then half of the heroes are doubled down on one of the factions that were revealed in the core box. So to give an example to contextualize that, The priest in the core box, Brother Boldstand, he's the gnome priest with the big mace. I absolutely love his character so much. In the expansion, we have the gambler class represented by a character named Pascal. He's a half-elf. They both come from a faction called Freeport, which is a mercantile city-state. It has a very 14th to 16th century European vibe going on. We call it like the D&D faction because it's the most easily recognizable. I don't want to spoil it. We'll go into it further, but they're really, really cool. And that gives you kind of an idea. Those two characters would both come from the same area, right? So another example is Amara, the warlord class from the core box. She's sort of like the central character for the adherence to Zenith, the good guy half of the core box. I shouldn't say good guy. There's really no good guys or bad guys in the game. The primary distinction is that the adherents to Zenith refuse to use the resource Devithay. The iconoclasts do use it. Some of them use it because they have to, some of it because they just see it as a resource. They don't care where it comes from. Amara is the warlord class. She comes from an area called Mutamba, which is a pastoral society of warriors and mystics which inhabit the Great Savannah. So the character Kechiwaya, who is the monk from the expansion, the hero expansion, he comes from the same area that she does. So when you hold those two models next to each other, you'll go, oh, okay, I got a sense of what this faction is like and what I can expect in the future from them. For a snippet of lore on their faction, they are currently locked into a permanent twilight in their homeland. They did this purposefully to hide themselves from the wars and the ravaging hordes that were devastating Chael. However, it's slowly destroying their land, right? They're in this permanent state of not day, not night, and they desperately need to find a solution to get themselves out of this state, or their homeland will be destroyed. And then finally, as an example of these kind of pairs of characters or heroes from the core box and the expansion, the hero expansion, that come from the same faction, just to give everybody a sense of like where we were going with it. Inquisitor Calth, who is the main character from the core box, he is an evil Inquisitor. He comes from a faction called the Immortal Host. They are the dominant faction in the game. They've nearly established dominion over all of Chael. They've subjugated every other faction in the game, almost every other faction. And they are a fanatical theocracy who draw their lineage from the former overgod of destruction, who's we call Hasathan. And they are the preeminent faction, right? And we'll explain like why everyone is working together in the course of the core box game. I don't want to spoil anything. In the hero expansion, there is a warlock class represented by the character Dextrioth. He is an infernal elf. So he's, think of like if you mixed a tiefling and an elf together, that's kind of gives you an idea of what they are. And they both come from the Immortal Host, and then they have a long history of working together in the backstory as well. So the Immortal Host is in a really interesting position, but I don't want to spoil it because it's revealed during the course of the core game, like what's going on with them. So that was a lot of names and information. Hopefully it wasn't too much of an info dump, and it gives you a sense of the amount of lore and history we have built into this setting. We really want this to become a rich and engaging fantasy world that people can get excited about and really dive into, because we've definitely put the hours in on our end to give us a starting point that we hope will be very enticing. And I also wanted to clarify, you heard me saying a class represented by this character. So the core box, it's open it up and play and go, right? We have pre-made characters. You customize them through leveling up, but they have preset stats and all that sort of stuff. But a big part of the game is we wanted the ability for players to be able to make their own heroes, right? So that's like one of the main things which I've discussed in previous episodes that I think will give the game longevity and make it, there's just so much more to explore and do, right? Like you could go back and replay the core game with your own custom heroes. Now, obviously the story wouldn't necessarily make sense because there's characters talking that you're not using. But on a second playthrough, when you already know what's going to happen and the story is not such a big deal, you could try it with custom heroes. And that's what the hero expansion specifically dives into, is showing you how to make your own heroes, where you select, we use the term heritage instead of race, because heritage is a mix of race and ethnicity, and that's more representative of the game itself. Because, like I've said before, every faction, or not every, but you could find elves, humans, dwarves, etc., gnomes. spread out throughout the world, right? So you could choose your own heritage, class, etc. So, for example, to go back to Canthus, which we were discussing in the beginning, he's a Dark Knight. The Dark Knight is the prototypical Dark Knight wouldn't look like Canthus. It would look more like a Chaos Knight, or like a character from like Final Fantasy, where it's like not necessarily an evil knight, but it's a knight that draws all of their special power from pain that they feel internally, whether it's physical or emotional pain, right? So if you were to go and make your own Dark Knight character class, you could, for example, choose an elf or a half-orc, or whatever the case may be, and you can make it your own, right? So instead of having a sword and shield like Canthus has, you could have like a great sword, and ornate black plate mail armor, whatever you wanted, right? Within the confines that class presents to you. So all of the heroes in the core game, in the expansion, which are pre-made, they give you a taste of what you can do with that class. Now, we decided as a design choice to not go with sort of the prototypical example of a class, right? Using Canthus again as for context, instead of giving you a Dark Knight that had black armor, black great sword, sort of what you expect, spikes on the armor, very intimidating, very, very dramatic looking. We decided to go with, okay, what would a Dark Knight from the Vestiary look like, right? Because we wanted to root it in the lore of the game. So that's what we did. If you were going to make your own, you could do whatever you wanted. Another example of this would be Amara, the Warlord class. So she represents what a Warlord from Matomba would look like. However, if you wanted to make your own Warlord, and you wanted him to be more of a traditional look with maybe holding a flag, a sword with some form of armor, kind of pointing forward, leading the troops, you could do that. The other part of that is we wanted all the miniatures in the game to look unique, right? Because, for example, the fighter class, there's a gajillion models out there that you've already seen that would make a really cool fighter. But we chose Ajax, who comes from a faction called the Pan-Helios League, which obviously has a Greek-Roman influence to their aesthetic. And the result was we have a model that looks absolutely just badass, excuse my French, and is unique, right? He looks super duper cool. However, again, if you wanted to make your own fighter, you could do whatever you want. You could make a goblin fighter with a light armor, a spear, and shield, or whatever the heck you wanted to do. And so going forward, we will feature faction versus faction boxes with accompanying PvE adventures for each faction. We're doing that so that we can get content out there as quickly as we reasonably can. Obviously, with 18 factions to explore, doing even 2 per year, that's a long time, right? And when I said we had a 10-year plan, I was serious. And that way we can provide content for people that want to play PvE or PvP. So the plan, to use Canthus again as our ongoing example, is when we got to the point where we were doing the Vestiary versus whomever they were paired with, that gives you all the models you need for each faction, so that you could have a full party of Vestiary models where they all have like a cool insect theme. And then they're versus another faction where it gives you all the models you need for a faction from that region that are all thematically linked, so all the models look like they clearly belong together. And then we'll have PvE adventures for people that prefer to play that way, where we'll have monsters that are themed to that faction, right? And the easiest one to use as an example is when we get to the Pan-Helios League, from which Ajax comes. You would have them versus another faction so that we can get all those models out there quickly. And then there will also be a PvE expansion where they would fight monsters you would expect to see from, Greek or Roman mythology, and they would have an adventure linked to the lore of their faction. So that's sort of the game plan going forward. And I think it'll be really exciting, and it'll be very cool, and it'll keep people engaged over time. And of course, you could supplement this with your own models. Like you found a really cool 3D print you wanted to do, or you just had models in your collection that you could use. You could implement that as well. And of course, assuming that we continue to go forward and have success, we'll expand out the factions as we go with splash releases of models that would work for a faction, because obviously there's, effectively infinite amount of permutations within a faction of like, I want a female dwarf dread mage with X equipment. When you multiply that out times all the combinations, it becomes, it's crazy. But that's cool because that gives the depth to the game, right? Like there's always something new to do. There's always a new permutation to explore. And so as a starting point in the hero expansion, we have the two general factions. It's all the story of how this happens is really cool in the hero expansion, but basically you have the two broad overarching super factions, so to speak, of the Iconoclast and the Adherence to Zenith, which I explained before. And we did this on purpose because these are like blended super factions. It's like basically you can include a very wide variety of aesthetics within those. It's kind of like the choose your own adventure factions. And we did that as a starting point to make it easier for people to just jump in and play. So beyond all of that forward planning, as of another update, another very exciting update, we've decided to add art to the cards in the game for items and abilities. So that obviously is a big task because there's a lot of cards. We're going with black and white art just because it saves time and it's much more cost effective. However, I'm not saying that to like say we're skimping on the quality at all. It's just that was the only realistic option for us within the time frame. It is going to slow us down a little bit, but since we're waiting on getting the hero molds done, I don't think it should delay us by very much. We're working very, very quickly on this, so hopefully it's not a delay at all. But I just wanted to throw that out there that the cards are going to look much nicer as a result. I'm really pleased with the way they look. Plus, I personally have a soft spot in my heart for the black and white style art, as it reminds me of early D&D and a lot of my favorite art from the Warhammer universe. For the art in the books, it's going to be almost all full color. We're really, really pleased with how it's turning out. It took a long time to find a studio that we could work with that was reliable. Like finding artists is really, really challenging. The best artists are just booked, right? Like I reached out to some of my favorite, like Adrian Smith and some of these big name artists, and they politely said, I don't have time, which, hey, it's totally understandable. So we finally found a studio after like literally years that's affordable, very good quality, and they're very professional. They get things done on time. So I'm really excited to start debuting some of the full color art that we'll have in the book. Some of the art is black and white, but it's exceptional. Not that there's anything wrong with black and white art. I just like to be transparent. We are also in the middle of the page layouts and formatting for the rulebook for the core game. That's turned out to be much, much more complicated than I had thought it would be. Going from a finished draft to the laid out book is pretty complex. I've never done it before. The end result, though, is going to be, I think it's going to be head and shoulders above what people are used to in a normal board game. Like, it looks really, really nice. But I should be able to show off some example pages soon with all like the graphics and the colors and the textures and all that sort of fun stuff that brings a book to life. But yeah, you definitely want to take the time to think through how you're going to make like diagrams to show how miniatures move, or how to use, the components in the game, or how to identify the cards and read them and the tokens. That turned out to be more challenging than I had thought, but we are getting it done relatively quickly now that we've got it figured out. So thank you so much for joining me for episode 7 of Making the Game from Concept to Kickstarter. Episode 8 will be out in 2 weeks, just as a reminder, because I will be gone next week. Thank you for listening, and I hope everyone has a wonderful week.